Well, good afternoon, students. Today I want to welcome you to uh, part two of my series on the American identity. What we're talking about, my goal with this is to talk about four major groups in American history that I think are fair game for essay questions. American identity is a big topic when it comes to AP US history, and the four groups that we're going to be looking at over this series are immigrants, Native Americans, African Americans, and women. And this presentation, we're going to be talking about the Native Americans. And I'm going to be looking just like I did previously with immigrants. Now I'm going to be talking about the Native Americans through these various time periods. So what we're just going to jump right in. We're going to start in the year 1491. Now we've talked about this before. 1491 basically signifies everything that happened leading up to European contact, if you will, before Columbus gets here. So when we talk about 1491 and the Native Americans, honestly, what you need to be familiar with is the migration patterns of the Native Americans. You need to be familiar with the maize cultivation of Native Americans. And when we talk about specific tribes, I guess the tribes I'd recommend, I mean, there's so many, there's no way you can remember them all. Remember the big ones. I would focus on the ones that are going to come up again and again throughout our history. Definitely know the Aztecs. Be familiar with the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. The Massasoit is one that you know, Squanto and the Pilgrims. The Powhatan and they're Jamestown in Virginia. The Seminoles, if you're familiar with Florida State Seminoles. The Cherokee, we're going to talk a lot about the Cherokee in our history. And then maybe some of the Plains Indians, the Sioux, the Comanche, Apache, those groups. Those are what I would be familiar with. Now, coming into 1491, we had nearly 7 million, to our best estimate, Native Americans living in the North American continent. What we're going to find that by 1750, that number is going to drop to almost 1 million. So we're going to go from the high point of 7 million down to about 1 million. And a lot of that is going to be due, honestly, most of that is going to be due to disease that's going to come about through Columbus and his entry into the New World and the Columbian Exchange. We know that Columbus came over in 1492. He was backed by the Spanish Empire, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And Columbus, the mistake of history that Columbus makes is basically not recognizing that he was not in India. So when he names the people he finds here and calls them Indians, that name sticks. And so that's where we get the name today. And you can refer to them as Native Americans. I have a tendency to switch back and forth between Native Americans and American Indians. But that's where they got their name. The next big year I want to talk about is 1494. This is when the Treaty of Tordesillas is signed, and that's basically a division of our world between the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. The idea is that there was this rush to claim land, and what we saw was that the Pope stepped in, divided up the world, and said, okay, Spain, you can go on this side of the line, Portugal on this side of the line. This is what's going to bring the Spanish more into North America. The Portuguese kind of get the raw end of this deal because they basically, within the Americas, just get Brazil. But when we talk about North America, we're going to talk about the Spanish coming in. When we get into the 1500s, that's really about the Spanish conquest in North America. We're going to see them come in and overtake the Aztec Empire. We're going to see the rise of new races, the mestizo race, during this time when the Spanish start to marry the Native American women. You're going to see the encomienda system start this time when they try to put the Native Americans into a form of slavery. So all this is going to happen in the 1500s. We're not going to see just the Spanish in North America, though. Honestly, what we have right now is a scramble for territory in North America, for influence in North America. And while we don't see the Portuguese so much in North America, we do see the French and the Dutch come in. So if you're going to look about where everything is going, you have the Spanish who are going to be down in southwest North America. You're going to have the Dutch, who are going to be in the area close to New York and New Jersey, and you're going to have the French primarily coming in from Canada along the St. Lawrence River, and they're eventually going to move into the Ohio River Valley. Now, when we look at the relationship the Native Americans had with the colonizing powers, we know that there was a lot of warfare. You had the Spanish, the big revolt there. Obviously, when they conquered the Aztecs, there was some warfare there, but then they're also going to have to deal with the Pueblo revolt down in the southwest. When you talk about the French for the most part get along with the Native Americans. They see, I think, the value in them because they're coming in and getting involved in the fur trade, and so they need the Native American help to find the best sources of fur throughout North America. The Dutch, well, let's face it, the Dutch swindled the Native Americans out of New York and Manhattan. So, the Dutch basically they had I guess it was a peaceful relationship, but it wasn't the relationship that we saw with the French. During this time, we don't see the English at all, with the exception of Roanoke. And I guess the only Native American tie you can have to that is maybe that could explain what happened to Roanoke, the lost colony of Roanoke. What happened to it? Were they integrated into Native American tribes? Were they decimated by North American tribes or Native American tribes? We just don't know. But leading up to 1607, this is all pre-British North America. The next time period, though, however, 1607 to 1754, is when we do see Great Britain come in. They're going to come in and settle Jamestown, and the Native American tribe you'll be familiar with in Jamestown is the Powhatans. And initially there was some peace between the Native Americans and the Powhatans. I mean, you have to look at the marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas, which brought the tribes and the settlement of Jamestown together. However, over time, you're going to see basically the Powhatan Wars are going to rise up during this time period as the English start encroaching more on Native American land. And before I go any further, let's just set the theme right now with regards to the relationship between the English and the Native Americans. The basic way you can remember it is, hey, get out of my way. Every place that the Native Americans are, the English are going to move there. And as they move there, they're like, get out of my way. I'm coming in. And we start to see the Native Americans being pushed further and further west. Also within this time period, you're going to see in the the New England colonies, you're going to see the Pilgrims come in and their relationship with Squanto, the Massasoit Indian. And then also after the Pilgrims, the Puritans are going to come in the 1630s. Now, they're not going to have the same relationship that you saw the Pilgrims have. In fact, they're going to have go into some wars with the Native Americans against the Mohegan or the Narragansett. Both, they're going to have and the big one is the Pequot War. The Pequot War, we talked about that, and the big battle there was the massacre at Mystic River. So not only the Pequot War, but the 1630s, you're also going to have King Philip's War during this time period between the Puritans and the Native Americans. The next big event with regards to American Indians is probably going to be 1676 and Bacon's Rebellion. You want to be familiar with that and what effect that had not only on the Native Americans, but the colonists in that area. That's going to bring us, I think, really up to 1754. I mean, I can go back here and we can talk a lot about the settlement patterns of the English colonists and what effect that had on the Native Americans. But again, the big things you need to know, I've already talked about, the different the wars specifically up in the New England region during this time. 1754 to 1763, we know that as the French Indian War. This is basically starts, George Washington comes in and gets this war started, and we see different alliances forming between the Native Americans, the colonists, and France. This is a war that is between France and England. Here it spills over into Europe and becomes the 7 Years' War. But here in North America, which is what we're concerned with, you see two tribes, the Mohegan and the Algonquin, ally themselves with the French and go to war against Great Britain and the colonists. Now the Iroquois, they weren't I wouldn't consider them a permanent alliance or an ally of Great Britain. However, they remained neutral during parts of the war, but they also did help the English quite often. So you can consider the Iroquois, the five nations of the Iroquois, as part of the English side of the French Indian War. This is just side note. The French Indian War is the first international war that's going to start and take place here in North America. There's only going to be a couple. There's not a lot of international wars, but this is one of them. Following the war, 1763 to 1783. For the colonists, we're going into the age of protest. But for the Native Americans, what we're doing is we're going into the first time that they're giving boundaries almost that they have to live in. What happens in 1763 is Pontiac's Rebellion. And Pontiac's Rebellion is when the Indians rose up. They came together under Chief Pontiac. Attacked several forts, attacked colonists who had crossed over the Appalachian Mountains in the newly gained territory from the French, and that rebellion led Great Britain to realize we cannot defend the colonists beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So that's when they instituted the Proclamation Line of 1763. Then we're going to go into the Revolutionary War in the 1770s, and we actually see the Native Americans fighting with both the colonists and the English during this war. They again, what we saw in the French Indian War, we're also going to see something similar during the Revolutionary War. Following the Revolutionary War, what we see is the United States expanding, and we expand beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and we go all the way to the Mississippi now. That makes up the United States of America. So what happens to all the Native Americans who live there as we want to move west? Well, what's the theme? Get out of my way. Westward expansion is going to kick in during this time period. We're going to get all the land from the Treaty of Paris, so moving all the way to the Mississippi. And then in 1803, with the purchase of Louisiana, we're going to move west of the Mississippi into right up to the Rocky Mountains is basically where the Louisiana Purchase cut off. As a response to the Louisiana Purchase, that is when Thomas Jefferson contracts Lewis and Clark to go explore that area, and they are aided and guided by Sacagawea. Now, a lot of people like to mix up Pocahontas and Sacagawea. Who came first, who came second? I think the easiest way is just put them in alphabetical. Pocahontas came first, and then Sacagawea followed her. And what we're going to start seeing now during this time period is the American incursion into Native American lands. This is really going to kick up the Missouri Compromise when we do that, and we designate slave and free states and how we're going to settle that land. A lot more people are going to start moving into that territory right up to the Mississippi River. 1676, I totally skipped over that. No, I didn't. I talked about Bacon's Rebellion, so okay, we're going to keep moving on. There's no edit key here. 1820 to the 1860s. 1820s and 1830s, 1830s, it's the only period in history that is named after one of our presidents. It's the Jacksonian time of our history. And we know, or we should know, Jackson's relationship with the Native Americans. 1831 is the Indian Removal Act, which basically is requiring the Native Americans to move out of their areas where we've discovered gold, specifically Georgia. This is going to lead to several Supreme Court cases. The most well-known one is Worcester versus Georgia, where John Marshall declares that the Cherokee Nation is an independent nation. Well, the last thing that Jackson wants is a nation within a nation. So what that's going to lead to is the Trail of Tears and the forced removal of the Native Americans to move them west. Now, we always focus on the Cherokee of Georgia, but the Native Americans, we go as far north as Kentucky and as far south as into Florida, and these Native Americans are put on a migratory path towards Oklahoma, which at that point Oklahoma was much larger. It actually stretched up into modern day Wyoming. But this is where they're going, and along the route, thousands of Native Americans died. That's why it's called the Trail of Tears. We get into the 1860s through the 1890s. Obviously, the 1860s is when we see the Civil War come in. But what also happens there is with a northern Congress, meaning the southern states have pulled out, we're going to see President Lincoln pass several key acts of legislation that's going to increase movement west. The first piece of legislation in 1862 is the Homestead Act, which is going to encourage settlers to move west beyond the Mississippi into the Great Plains, and beyond that all the way to the west coast if we can get there. And also the Pacific Railway Act. This is the plan to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad has a huge effect on the Native Americans, as that's going to lead to the elimination, almost the extinction, of the buffalo across the Great Plains, which is what is their source for life for those Native Americans. One battle that's often overlooked during this time, it's the Chivington Massacre, also known as the Sand Creek Massacre. That happens in 1864. So what that shows is we are, while we're fighting in the Civil War, we are still dealing and running military actions in the West against the Native Americans. And the Sand Creek Massacre is one of those events that you should be familiar with. Also during this time, I believe it's, I want to say 1780s, maybe 1880s, 1887. Don't quote me on that date. The Treaty of Fort Laramie. Treaty of Fort Laramie is when we promised the Sioux Indians, the Dakotas, that as long as the grass is green, they are able to stay there, or until we discover gold in the Black Hills. But that was the big treaty during this time. Also during this time period, 1876, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Geronimo is going to come up during this time, and the Comanche Wars are also going to occur during this time period. So there's a lot of things going on during this time period other than, the Civil War and Reconstruction. You got to remember, stuff is still continuing in the West. Time marches on during that time. There are no major wars, Indian wars, there's battles and stuff. There's no major Indian wars, I guess, during this time. Not like the Pequot Wars or King William's Wars. We have battles. But what we're going to move into during this time is the opportunity to try to domesticate the Native Americans. 1887, the Dawes Act. 1887 is when we try to assimilate the Native Americans into American society. The Carlisle School for Indians, and we try to get them to lose their culture, to give up their language, everything. And it doesn't work, but honestly, good thing it doesn't work, because especially the language part, because that's going to come into play during World War I and World War II. World War II, you're absolutely familiar with the Navajo code talkers. But World War I, we also used code talkers. We used the Choctaw during that time. So fortunately for us, the Dawes Act did not work the way we had hoped it would. Let's move on. 1914 to 1918. Well, I kind of just already touched on that. That is going to be the World War I, where the Native Americans do get involved in the war as code talkers. The Choctaw, like I said, they're the ones who are doing it. And those codes were difficult, or if not impossible, to break during this time. Moving on, 1924 is a big one. This is when Native Americans finally get citizenship in the United States. The last group in our country to gain citizenship. Immigrants have citizenship. African Americans have citizenship. But the Native Americans don't get actual citizenship until 1924. That's going to move us into 1934, right smack in the middle of the Depression, right smack in the middle of FDR's New Deal. And one of his major pieces of legislation is he creates the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And actually what he does is he returns to this idea of tribal sovereignty, getting away from, you're part of our country and that's it. Now the tribes, they're getting power back, which is a good thing, which FDR tried to do. I skipped one. I skipped one. The 1940s, I'm going to throw that up there. I don't have a slide for that, but what we're going to talk about with the 1940s is that's obviously World War II and the Navajo code talkers. Another thing I want to bring up is Iwo Jima. We talked about this in class. One of the guys who helps raise the flag, a Pima Indian by the name of Ira Hayes. Johnny Cash, the song, The Ballad of Ira Hayes, and we talked about him. You might want to be familiar with that. It's going to take us 1960s to present. And really, not a lot to talk about during this time, except in the 1970s, we see the Native American Civil Rights Movement, AIM, AIM, the American Indian Movement. This is when they, they're going to start fighting for their own civil rights, much like we've seen with the African Americans and women. Now the Native Americans are going to step up. And finally, when we get closer to today, we're going to see basically the Native American tribes are starting to gain power and strength through gaming. A lot of the reservations, what they're allowed to do is they're allowed to have casinos and ski resorts, and it's helping rebuild their tribes and their lives and those reservations. So and because of this, for one example, the Pequot in Connecticut, the Pequot are able to make a comeback during this time because of, as they have their tribal sovereignty, now they can, get into the gaming industry. So that's going to help them a lot. That's going to wrap it up for our Native Americans. Hopefully I hit all the big points. Again, it's just kind of knowing it through the different time periods. If you can do that, you can start tying it all together. But really, especially once we get to 1754 all the way to 1763, the big idea is just get out of our way, because the Native Americans are going to just be pushed further and further west. So that wraps it up for Native Americans. I think the next one I'm going to do for you guys will probably be African Americans in America. So you guys have a great day. Thank you.